Thanks for coming to give the talk. And over to you on public acceptance, David.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to everyone for attending. I have a number of slides to get through, but I will try and cover it fairly, in good speed so that we can have a discussion, which I look forward to. So I will be talking about public acceptance. I do feel, again, having, as John has alluded to, having done this for a while, I do feel a bit like Charlie Brown, where these issues, the idea of carbon capture and storage has been a bit more problematic than might seem at the outset. In terms of the topics that I'll cover, the areas that I'll cover, which will be, as I said, kind of supported by work that we've done, but also work that some other survey work. I'll try and think about how we can understand the drivers of public attitudes. Say a little bit about international context. We've done some surveys, both historically and recently, on how the UK compares, but I think that there's something to be learned from the international context. Think about this question of public acceptance and what it really means, because one of the other striking things, not to give away any obvious points, but one of the other striking things, having done this for 15 odd years, is that the UK public is still, I don't know, blissfully, but still largely unaware of carbon capture and storage, and what that, how that affects the discourse, how it affects the politics, I think is an interesting question. In particular, I'll talk about a study that we did a couple of years ago in Peterhead and Scotland, more widely in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, and then kind of transitioning to where we are today, particularly in the context of industrial decarbonization. Talk about some results of a very recent survey that we did just a couple of weeks ago that gives at least some hints of maybe if you want, some of the challenges of industrial decarbonization. So I'll present these headline figures for the UK public, and we spend a lot of time thinking about representative publics, and I know Bayes has their tracker, which I find somewhat valuable. I think there are ways in which that could be made more valuable to the research community. But I think it is important to say that there is not a single public that matters particularly to an issue like this. When we are talking about, say, something like carbon capture and storage, because when I say that I do surveys on on public attitudes towards carbon capture and storage, people look at me a bit funny because, in many ways, if many people don't know about it, there's only so many questions that you can ask about an issue that people genuinely have a very tenuous hold of. But it will matter more in certain contexts. So I mentioned Peterhead, but obviously as we now move more to if you want, a regional and a kind of a localized strategy for deployment of CCUS, then it starts to matter more at the local and regional level. But still, in terms of the broader politics, say, in terms of investment and funding, there is still kind of interest in thinking about what national level interest is in the topic. And then, there are questions as to whether your degree of awareness will affect that. Now, obviously, if it becomes more salient, if you're potentially more salient, if there's a plant that's going to be in your general vicinity. But also you might have people who are generally more active and thinking about these issues regardless of where they where they reside. So, I think I probably don't need to be telling civil servants and people who think about these issues what, that the public does matter. But sometimes the way in which the public matters, it isn't completely clear. It isn't completely clear in the context of, giving so much money to a particular project or creating a new incentive mechanism. So the first thing to say is there are obviously multiple methodologies by which we might engage the public. One that I've spent probably the most time on is on these large-scale representative surveys. And although I'll be giving you the headline results, most of my time is spent doing the kind of the more detailed crunching of understanding, really which are the kind of socio-demographics or other factors that help explain attitudes. So trying to sort of unpick really what's going on in terms of these surveys. But then if you really want to get at things in a deeper way, in a way which kind of roll up our sleeves and think about these issues more deeply, you need to ask questions which aren't in closed form, which kind of get at kind of, why? What makes you say that? Why are you thinking that? And allow for a discussion, allow for a way of the public to maybe learn a bit more, and then see if that changes their view. And so I think, there are a number of different approaches that we can take. And the simplest and the cheapest would be to convene a focus group, which might just last a couple of hours. But then there are other mechanisms, which we've again been talking about more widely in the broader climate context of the Climate Assembly. And the particular example I'll be talking about here is a citizens jury, which is convened over the course of a number of days, where there's a number of different exercises that we get to employ with our groups. I won't talk about it here, but obviously Bayes has sponsored a ScienceWise a report, which I'm told hopefully will be will soon see the light of day. So I look forward to that, having been involved in the kind of oversight panel for that. But I think that starts to get kind of a richer, more interesting approach, because you can then go into the kind of locations, go into the regions, and have a more sustained conversation about these sorts of issues. But there are still limitations to that, right? I mean, it's asking people, or rather paying people, to spend some time thinking about carbon capture and storage is informative, and I'm not taking away from the work that I've done, or Bayes has commissioned, or the Citizens Assembly, or so on. But the reality, of course, is that most of the public doesn't have the time to devote to this, and so they won't do more than really scratch the surface. And so, I guess the questions are what lessons we can get from these different forms of engagement. And this is just a different way of saying what I've said, which is that we have a number of different forms which have implications, both in terms of kind of whether you can get any sort of statistically significant results from your analysis, or whether it's more great killer quotes or a more interesting anecdotal results. Can you do something that's more deliberative from a democratic point of view? That's a good thing, but what are the broader implications that we can draw from that? I think that's an interesting question. And then, again, I shouldn't be needing to tell the folks in the room this, but we do have to think about costs. We think about it locally, but as academics running these things, but with an infinite amount of money and time, there's lots of things that could be done, but there is a question of where scarce resources should be spent. So what does public what are public attitudes towards carbon capture and storage? The first point, I suppose, and this is, we have data going back to 2004, but just looking at the last half dozen or so surveys that we've done through the UKCCS Research Center, you know, the number who say that they are very familiar is vanishingly small. The number who say they're somewhat familiar is not very big either. And so you have maybe, you know, 15-ish%, 15, maybe sometimes going on 20% that say they're, you know, not, you know, better than not very familiar. In general, you should read these assessments as being over-optimistic, right? People all, you know, tend to say that they know more about something than they actually do. So, so the first point is very few people say they know about carbon capture and storage, and that number is probably an overestimate. So how do you do better than a self-reported number? Well, you can start to ask about, you know, their actual understanding of these issues. So for a number of years, we've been asking this question, well, what does carbon capture and storage actually do? And again, quite strikingly, many people just say they don't know what it does. But interestingly, you know, some, you know, 40, 50% might say they give an answer, but many of them don't get the right answer. So, you know, there, you know, more people than not say that they, you know, CCS can address climate change, you know, but of the 40% that say that, half of them think that it also is addressing toxic waste. More than half of them would think that it's addressing ozone depletion. So I think that that's one obvious challenge. Yeah, at an even more basic level, the Eurobarometer did a study a number of years ago on CCS of a number of countries with an interest in the subject. And the number for the UK is, you know, 54% get the right answer when they're asked what CO2 is. I think there were only two answers. It's carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, or don't know. And so whenever you see that 50% of the public gets the right answer, that's, no, as you'll know, no better than flipping a coin. So, you know, this doesn't necessarily give you a huge amount of sense that there's a great depth of knowledge. We ask a number of questions more to do with geology or atmospheric science. And we've recently done an 8-country study, which I won't get into very much, but which touches on a whole number of issues, including greenhouse gas removal technology. And we did this in Britain. And you know, there's a significant number of people that believe that dinosaurs were alive 1 million years ago. Which would have meant, you know, humans would have coexisted with dinosaurs. I guess you could say that the UK is a bit better than some of our international comparators, but that's really maybe not saying very much. And maybe more pertinent to the climate case and that conflation I mentioned in the previous example of ozone depletion. You know, there's a significant fraction to this day that continue to conflate climate change with ozone depletion, and quite a large number of you know, Britons believe that climate change is caused by a hole in the Earth's atmosphere. You know, what are the implications of some of these misunderstandings? You can sometimes joke about it, but in other cases, well, if you're going to imagine having a sustained discussion, there's a lot of, you know, misunderstandings. One of the other questions I don't mention here is, you know, we ask people how deep they think oil and gas deposits are. And most people believe that it's 100 meters below the surface rather than more than a kilometer below the surface. You know, the implications of, you know, risk perceptions, I think are quite important. The other issue, of course, is that although there is low awareness, again, this is back to the Eurobarometer study, where again, very few people admit to having heard of CO2 capture and storage. When we go on, and this is something that we see consistently in our work, so 25% say might have a belief that they know what carbon capture and storage is, but then with the very next question, if you ask what their opinion is, maybe 70% are willing to give you their view, which is quite striking, and you run into the danger of what my Dutch colleague Donker Damen, described as a pseudo opinion. We speak a lot about opinions on subjects, but how deep are these opinions when moments after having answered that they know about a subject, or they don't know about a subject, they're willing to opine on it. Interestingly, people don't, they're not actually that time inconsistent, which is also interesting. So we ask, again, we've asked this sort of question many times, but what about a portfolio of options? Where does CCS fit within a wider portfolio? I think it is very clear from our data and others that there are certain options that are very popular. So afforestation, planting trees, is very popular. Solar energy is very popular. Every survey that we've done for the last 15 years shows both of those things. Once you go beyond that, there's very few options that are nearly as popular. Even wind energy is not, there are these pockets of resistance. CCS, we see that off, kind of larger purple bars, meaning neutral, and larger green bars, meaning don't know, than with regard to things like forests or solar energy. On the green versus blue divide, again, all we give people is one sentence, one saying it's either from renewables or from CO2 storage, from natural gas originally. And you see this significant drop-off in support for blue hydrogen relative to green hydrogen. But certain other options, again, based on just a very little bit of information, are clearly disfavored by the public. And so, options that are closer to geoengineering, like putting aerosols into the stratosphere, or ocean iron fertilization, again, get these very consistent low levels of support and strong levels of opposition. Again, I mentioned we asked this question multiple times with regard to CCS. We don't see a growth in support. We don't see a particular growth in opposition. But again, we see a division, a fairly persistent division with lots of question marks over the subject. So those are some of the survey results, but then maybe I'll talk briefly about some of the kind of the more deliberative approaches that we use, and in particular this set of focus groups that we did in 2017 in Scotland, in Peterhead, in Aberdeen, and Edinburgh, and similarly two right around that same time citizens juries, one in Aberdeen and one in Edinburgh. We try and again have a fairly balanced sample. We bring in some wonderful expert speakers. And then, we can use these events to try and gauge, how people's views change over the course of several days. So, I thought it was interesting that even in Aberdeen, the strength of feeling for the kind of importance of continued oil and gas extraction diminished at least slightly over the course of that time period. Even though we did provide a fair bit of information on CCS, the enthusiasm for using gas with CCS is not very high. There's a lot of question marks. There's, arguably more support, but obviously, but also more opposition to using unabated natural gas. Whereas natural gas with CCS, even though we spent a fair bit of time in the citizens' juries on talking about CCS, people just still weren't quite willing to give their views, and their views weren't, kind of, they weren't negative, but they weren't also, overtly enthusiastic on the subject. In addition to kind of understanding how people's views change in these deliberative processes, we also can use it to kind of have a deeper discussion. For example, priority setting, and kind of iterate back and forth, use a number of exercises to understand, where different groups come down with regard to different priorities. And in particular, I wanted to mention these two focus groups that we did in Peterhead, right? Peterhead is a relatively small, actually poor by Aberdeenshire or Scottish standards, poor town, reliant on the fishing industry, where the gas plant is actually quite prominent. And we were actually a bit worried as to how people would react. We were doing, as I mentioned, this kind of exercise in early 2017, not long after, only a year after the government had canceled the £1 billion CCS competition that was meant to potentially bring, very significant resources, construction jobs into Peterhead. And, we always knew that, public awareness of the details of the CCS demonstration was not well known. This is, on a nationally representative sample. But going into Peterhead, we thought, well, actually, okay, well, there must be some recognition here. But in fact, of the kind of 19 randomly selected residents of Peterhead, only one person, 5-ish%, said they knew a lot about it. Only 3 of the 19 said they knew, essentially something about it. And well, I mean, I think that's pretty damning, but it also maybe explains why, we didn't actually see very much political opposition to the cancellation of the CCS competition, because if folks in Peterhead itself aren't aware, aren't aggrieved, then it's one of the easier decisions that a politician could have made. I mean, when we ask about it, people generally were fairly enthusiastic. They thought it was, a very good idea, or a pretty good idea, a fairly good idea. Nevertheless, it is, I think, striking that there was this kind of complete lack of awareness. And I think those are interesting questions. So why was nobody aware? I mean, some of it has to do with the kind of hypothetical nature of that project, the fact that it was something out there that wasn't actually built. The folks in Peterhead would go on at length about a very small biomass plant, because there were kind of lorry deliveries at night, and they found those really annoying and disruptive, and they could go on about all sorts of other issues, to do offshore wind and things that were visible. But even though this was potential major investment, it was completely lost on them. The other thing, I think, which was clearly a deterrent, is the level of trust. And we found this both in Aberdeen itself and in Peterhead, despite Aberdeen being so reliant on the oil and gas industry. The support or trust in the industry is very low. We ask a number of questions to do with trust on a regular basis. People generally, this is not tooting our own horn, but generally are more trusting of university scientists. But when we ask about the actors that are most engaged in communications with regard to specific projects, like oil and gas companies, you see very large numbers who don't trust them at all, or kind of on a scale of 1 to 7. 60% would give it a 1, between a 1 and a 3. And similarly, in terms of the governments themselves, which might also be the other obvious actors supporting CCS or supporting these projects, again, general trust in government is also quite low globally, and Britain in particular. So one of the very positive things that I think came after the cancellation of the CCS demo competition was the reboot that involved the Cost Challenge Task Force, which a number of us in the UKCCSRC were involved in, led by Claire Perry at the time as Energy Minister. And I think one of the biggest benefits, again, speaking as a political scientist, was the fact that it actually created a political momentum for support of industrial decarbonization, for support of almost as an accident or as a knock-on for carbon capture and storage. And if you look at there's often a lot of attention on these so-called red wall seats. These are seats with a very significant number of manufacturing jobs. And if you look at the seats where we saw the greatest gains by the Conservatives, they're the ones with the most manufacturing. I think that the politics of that aren't lost on the current government. So what's interesting, and these are just results from our very latest survey from a couple of weeks ago, we asked a couple of questions to do with, what role that our survey sample, the 2,000 people that we consulted, that they see for manufacturing in the kind of future of the UK economy. And again, it's not a big number. I mean, it's maybe 25% that kind of play, are in the blue bars that see it as key to the future. But of those number of 20-odd%, 10-20%, they're overwhelmingly conservative voting. They're overwhelmingly older. They're overwhelmingly from the kind of C2DE, kind of lower socioeconomic classes, and overwhelmingly leave voting, and also a bit more male skewed. I mean, a lot of these things are obviously correlated, and I want to spend some time and disentangle that to see what are the real drivers. But clearly, there's a lot of alignment there with regard to prioritizing manufacturing. When we dig down deeper, and again, I was almost surprised by how this wasn't as much of a regional issue as it was a socio-demographic issue. In other words, people in the South, where there aren't really very many industrial clusters to speak of, placed as much importance on it to the kind of future of the economy as those in the North or Scotland or wherever. So, and again, we see that same pattern: conservative voting, older, C2DE, male, and leave voting supporters are very strong supporters of industrial clusters. And then the interesting bit is we then ask them about the industrial decarbonization challenge, which I'm at least been involved in on the advisory board, and I think we get this kind of fascinating answer that when we say government's spending £200 million for this industrial decarbonization challenge, and we list the clusters, so we even list saying it's in South Wales and the Humber and Scotland and so on. So again, striking that there still isn't very much of a regional split, but the socio-demographics completely flip, and support for industrial decarbonization is actually strongest among labor voters, among young voters, among kind of higher socioeconomic class voters. The gender gap closes, and also this is again a much more popular sell to remain voting rather than leave voting respondents, which again, fascinating sort of insights. The other bit of it that I have lots of data on but didn't want to get into here is more generally the view or the question as to CO2 removals, and this is not just CCS, but speaks to greenhouse gas removal program more generally, and afforestation, which I mentioned is very popular. And again, looking at it over time, we ask, where government should place its bets, where it should have its priorities. And unsurprisingly, new energy sources, solar, wind, bioenergy are kind of top, and they're consistently top. Many of these other options like public transport, energy conservation are quite steady. And the one issue that has risen, one issue that has clearly dropped is any effort on new oil and gas reserves. So that dropped from about 16% to about 3% in our most recent survey. Whereas ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is starting to rise up, very much rise up the agenda of the public. The other interesting question that we asked in our most recent survey was to get at this whole question of permanent storage and whether permanent storage has a value. Again, going in, my prior was that people would be much more interested in trees, or believe that trees are a good thing, and they'd be a bit more skeptical about CO2 storage as a result of CCS. And so we split the sample, and for half the sample, we just gave the wording without the red text. And to the other half of the sample, we provided some additional information that the CO2 was being stored in trees for about 100 years, but in the case of permanent, or in the case of CO2 storage under the North Sea, would be there for many millennia. And interestingly, that did have quite a statistically significant impact, where people viewed with that bit of additional information, they viewed the idea of CCS in a more positive light. Again, other fodder for discussion. And then I just wanted to end with a few takeaways. The first is, as you might expect from somebody who spends his time, or at least a chunk of his time, thinking about public perceptions, there is no silver bullet. There are many different ways of both assessing and engaging with different publics, and that multiple approaches are desperately needed. The idea of communicating about something that doesn't actually exist, or that people can't see easily, I think is a challenge, and has proven to be very challenging. But the problem is, you can't also hold off in any sort of public communications activities until spades are until the construction phase has actually begun. I was struck by the fact that the folks at Shell actually thought that they had quite a successful public engagement activities in Peterhead. So I do think that is one of the big challenges. People need to recognize that it's not just communicating the material, but who's doing the communication, and finding a way of actually assessing whether any of that lands is quite important. And in that context, the centrality of trust and credibility, the wider context in which this discussion is happening, the need for not doing this as kind of a burst or a one-off, but to have a more sustained effort is actually critical to this process. And I think then finally, from that last a couple of slides on industrial clusters, I think there's an interesting tension between support for continued investment in industrial clusters as industrial clusters versus support for decarbonizing those clusters. Okay, that's it. Look forward to your questions and the discussion.